cryptically titled How to Grow an Architect. I'm Duncan Reid. I work for Microsoft New Zealand. I have the dubious title of Enterprise Architect. Spent an hour this morning trying to figure out what it was that meant. This afternoon's session really is for, well, all sorts of people really. You might be an architect of some sort already. You might not be an architect and might want to be one. If you came this morning, you might have figured out maybe what an architect is and maybe what some things are that we do, and then decided that you didn't want to be one. Then you probably wouldn't be here. If you're an architect already, you're probably wondering future career things, what next, how to grow as an architect, what kinds of things do I need to be doing, who do I need to be in touch with, how do I set up a personal development plan, how do I get myself into a position where I'm really being valued for what I do and turn from this sad face to a smiley face. If you're thinking about transitioning into an architecture role, how that works, what kind of people can be architects, what kind of characteristics you need, what kind of training you might need, and how do you move on from being a new architect into being, I don't know, fully fledged pro maybe. So going from being a sad person to a happy architect. There we go. So a couple of key questions, I guess, for you before I start asking questions about and giving you advice about things. Do you know what kind of an architect you want to be? We talked this morning quite a lot, and I'll come back to it in another slide in a minute. There's lots and lots of different types of architect doing lots and lots of different things. And that's great, they're all valid. But they're not the same, and need different skill sets and different measures. However, as we go through this afternoon, we'll see that there are things that are essential characteristics that we need to grow to help that architect grow into the role and become more and more influential. For me, the whole point of being an architect is really about getting us to a position where the most senior technical people in an organization, who are the most trusted people, the business people, the CIO, the CFO, can come to you and say, hey, I need your advice on a thing. Tell me all about it. And you can feel that when you've given them some advice, they've gone away happy and believing you. Now, to make sure that kind of thing can happen, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you're going to need to have. The first one, and this kind of what are you talking about slide, is to really just make sure that you're not facing an identity crisis and that you do know what kind of architect you want to be. And then we can talk about how we want to get there. One of the other challenges in being an architect, and certainly if you're transitioning into the role of an architect, is having an understanding of what that might mean in terms of your longer term career. I guess broadly speaking, certainly my viewpoint is that architecture and being an architect of whatever kind isn't really a means to an end. It's a bit of an end in itself. And using it as a step in a pathway through a technology career up to being, you know, if you aspire to be a CIO or whatever, you know, the top of the technology tree, whilst it won't harm your chances of doing that, I wouldn't say that architecture is necessarily the thing that is a clear standard kind of pathway to that. One of the reasons, and that's not a bad thing, I have to say, one of the reasons from my perspective, I've been an architect a long time. I've had the A word in my title for probably about 15 years now. And one of the good things about it is when you get it right, within an organization, you have an awful lot of influence over people. But by and large, without the pain in the backside of having to manage a large team of people. I've also been a head of IT CIO before. And for the difference that it makes in terms of your overall influence on the organization and the things that you can put in and therefore get out of an organization that you work for, I'd take being an architect any day over being a CIO. When I looked at the comparable two things and said, well, you know what, where was I happiest? Having 200 people to manage and all those other things that go with it, that meant I was actually focused on managing people, or actually whether I could focus on having a small team of people who were trusted advisors to the rest of the business, doing important things with technology and business that meant a difference to the way we were carrying on as an organization. That actually was a much more comfortable place for me to be anyway. But it's just something to think about in terms of your broader career about where you might want to get to, because a little bit of a warning, architecture is not necessarily a standard step in a career progression. There's lots and lots and lots of different types of architect. And it would be easy to think that maybe they're all different, maybe there are all different skill sets needed, maybe there's all sorts of different ways of growing architects, which is what this session's all about. And how could you possibly say there are some characteristics that are the same for all of them? But, you know, my experience is that actually there are. And the simplest way of summarizing it is that most of what you do as an architect, whilst it depends on your technical background and your technical skills to some degree, it isn't really about that. It's about a whole raft of other things that are shared across all of those, and that's what this session's going to be all about. So, where do we find architects from? They tend to be a fairly expensive breed. There seem to be a whole raft of different ways that people come into architecture. As this diagram clearly shows, I think the best place to find an architect is at Mardi Gras. But how would you identify an architect out of that group of people, and then how would you grow them? I guess the other point a little bit of this slide is, certainly my view, is that you can take anybody from a structured thinking background and grow them into being an architect. I don't believe that you have to have a hard technical background to be an architect. I think in certain circumstances it helps, but I don't think it's a formal prerequisite. I think that most of the skills that you will use in your day-to-day, most challenging parts of being an architect are things that are not about the hard technical background that you may have come up through. I certainly, I spent a number of years as a DBA, and I did computer science and all that kind of stuff as a degree many years ago. Do I use it in my day-to-day role of being an architect? Very rarely is the short answer. I tried to draw out a few of my musings on what architects are like. And when I wrote the list and had these kind of switch behaviors in there, I thought, maybe I'm suggesting that as architects we're a little bit flip-flop and can't make our minds up. But actually, architects have to betray quite an extraordinary number of different character traits to be successful in an organization. None of these things are about the technology, you see. We tend to be forceful people, by and large, particularly if we come from a hard technical background. You know, we've done lots of hard thinking before. We've designed and implemented lots of systems. And in that space, we know we're right. Well, you kind of are. But that doesn't mean you're right for the right time. You get used to having the hard conversations with people. It's usually the architect who has to put his hand up and say, oh, that project looks like a bit of a mess, and I think you're wasting a couple of $1 million here. Nobody else will front up to it, but the architect often has to. You have to try and herd the cats quite often. Something you see all the time. I don't know how many of you in this room are architects and how many of you have been asked to wade into a project that looks like it's going horribly wrong and say, hey, can you get in there and fix that, please? So you have to get in there and take charge of things and then let it go. You have to be really, really straight with people. But then the interesting things start to come at the bottom. So actually you have to think things through and create time for thinking. That's something we'll talk about in how we grow an architect. One of the things about transitioning into an architecture role is that you have to create some time to think. Is that you have to move yourself out of the doing. And one of the hardest things, certainly when I was transitioning into being an architect away from being a deep technical person, was that letting go of the doing. I spend almost all of my time now talking about the doing, which is liberating in some respects and terrifying in others when I realize how fast the doing moves on. And that's one of the other challenges, again, we'll talk a bit more about, is how do you strike that balance as an architect between maintaining the confidence of technical teams that you will work with every day so that they don't think you're some guy who's just come out of nowhere and what does he know about the environment you're working in, but you know enough about what they're doing so that, you know, rightly or wrongly, you can't have the wool pulled over your eyes. It's quite a fine line to work. Patience is a personal characteristic that sometimes I lack, I have to say. It is something that you find yourself, as an architect, having to dig deep into a reserve of patience that maybe you didn't know you had. And one of the hard ones is how to keep yourself in a position where you're self-aware. How do you pull yourself out of the situation and have a look and see whether you're actually exhibiting the rest of those character traits? Are you actually being thoughtful? Are you helping people? Are you actually allowing people to do the work that they need to do, or actually have you taken charge of it? And you do have to have the tools and techniques available to you to be self-aware at all times as an architect. It can be a pretty brutal game if you're not open to criticism, open to input at all times. So here are some of the things that we all do. So if you think back to that slide a few slides ago, the green one that said, hey, look, we've got software architects, we've got infrastructure architects, we've got application guys, we've got integration people, all of whom are architects at one level or another. Widely different skill sets, different levels of technical and business input depending on where they're at in their day or the project that they're working on. But here are some of the characteristics that all architects actually have to deal to. And these are the things really that I want to talk about today, mostly about the things that all architects do. And they tend to be, the things, certainly for those of us with a technical background, tend to be a little bit kind of nebulous and a bit hard to put your finger on and actually out of our comfort zones. And that's one of the things to be a really good architect, is that you have to get yourself out of your comfort zone as often as you can and into the place where you're learning new stuff. Because you're dealing with complex problems. By and large, a complex problem is complex from a number of different directions. There'll be people in the mix exhibiting some really peculiar behavior that you don't quite understand. There'll be some business process that was put in there when the company had 6 people and now it's 6,000, and it just looks like it doesn't fit anymore. And there'll be some technology that maybe some vendor's trying to sell you, or that you've written, 10 years ago, and it kind of all hangs together in a higgledy-piggledy way. All these moving parts going on, and you kind of, as an architect, you've got to try and figure out where you're going to unpick that beast from without it all just kind of collapsing. We create stuff. So whilst I stand around these days mostly and talk about things, I guess I would say that I'm somewhere in the creative cycle. I am helping organizations and other people think about how to solve a real complex problem. And that does involve being creative. As an architect, you can't turn stuff out of a book. There isn't an architecture manual that works. There's methodologies and all sorts of stuff that can help you, that are tool sets to help you do your thinking. But what you can't do with architecture is turn to page 1 of the book and work your way through to 500 and then everything comes out at the end. It's not like that. You've got to be able to communicate. I find this setup actually really odd as an architect. Whenever I go and talk to my customers, the first thing I try and make sure I'm doing is that I'm not lecturing to people and doing 100% send. It's not what an architect's all about. You're actually, communication is two-way, and it's not about somebody up there in lights telling people what to do. However, we are where we are, so that's fine. You've got to figure out how to work with people. Proper collaboration, which involves having tools at your disposal to actually allow you to see other people's viewpoints, even if you don't understand them. To be able to recognize it as being a different viewpoint and being valid, and still completely incomprehensible to you. That's fine. It's fine if you don't understand it, but at least you know it's there. And if you know it's there, you've got a chance of dealing with it. Living with ambiguity. Well, I said it's the stock in trade. That is one of the things that's actually common to anybody who's done anything technical. How many times have you found yourself on a project where there aren't any requirements? Nobody's written anything down. What do we want? We want a thing. What does it look like? We don't know. Why do you want it? Well, because it needs to go faster. It happens all the time. And, as an architect, you get wheeled into this sort of stuff and say, well, you're a senior guy, you're an architect, you've been through all these sorts of things. Well, you sort that out. The answer, I don't know what it is that I'm sorting out, really is not a good or a valid one. You just have to get in there and figure it out, which means that you've got to be able to figure out which bits of the ambiguous position you're in are important and which bits you can ignore. Because everybody will tell you that everything's important all the time. And that's where you have to be able to think across the piece, that whole holistic thinking thing. and comes back a little bit to that creating time to think, is you need to be able to take yourself offline out of the situation and have a bit of a muse about, well, how do these different behaviors impact people? What is actually the real problem here? How are the problems related to each other? How do the viewpoints relate to those problems, to relate to the solution that the really important person or the really important problem is looking for solution? And that's pretty tricky to do. There's a whole bunch of skill sets that I'll talk about in a little while around that space. And the last one, the one that I feel is probably the most important of all, is how to influence people. Everybody other than you is coming at life from a different perspective than you are. How you get them to see your perspective on things and how you get to understand their perspective on things, and then how you use that information to move towards the goal that you're jointly aiming for. You can't be an architect unless you know how to do that. It's one of those things that people from, well, I say generalizing there, I found I was quite skeptical about the influencing learning stuff. Again, hard technical background. I thought, oh, I'm not sure how you can be taught to influence people. Feels a bit kind of mushy social science thing to me. But you can. You can be taught this stuff. You can learn it. There are things, there are tools, and we'll talk about those in a little while. So those are some of the things that, regardless of what kind of an architect we are, we're all going to be faced with. And you'll know there's no real technology problems on there. Those are about people and about thinking and about communicating. Having said that, the addressing complex problem stuff is probably a key area where the tools and methodologies kick in. And like most little groups of people who kind of self-certify, architects have tools and methodologies at their disposal. I've had the fortune stroke misfortune to use all of these things that you see up in front of you, frameworks, methodologies, whatever you care to call them, to various levels in various organizations over the years. I've worked with organizations who use these things and for organizations who use these things. I've worked for organizations who use a different methodology than the organization that they're working with. My humble, less than humble opinion is that none of them work very well, actually. None of them are complete, and they serve really badly at least one part of the architecture community, depending on which place you're looking at. And the trick with your tools and methodologies as you grow to be an architect is knowing which bits to ignore and which bits to take out of the different methodologies that you have available to you. If you're transitioning into being an architect, I would say that there's probably no getting away from the fact that you need to go and get certified in one of these somewhere. You'll then discover how much of it was irrelevant. But I can't really tell you that there's a quick fix to being able to figure that out before you've actually gone and done all the ball-ache work to get there and say, yeah, that wasn't very important. Because again, it's about viewpoints. There's some stuff in there that will be very important to you and others that won't be. But for somebody else, they'll take a whole different view of things and take different things from it. The Zachman framework really isn't a methodology. It's just a framework for ordering your thoughts. You may have seen the 9x9 grid. I'm not going to reproduce it here, which kind of gives you a little map to frame up your problem space. It tells you who's involved and why and what and kind of some of the how and the different considerations you might need to have. It's only going to help you order your thinking. And that's something I think probably carries through all of these, is that they are mostly tools to help you order your thinking as you think around the problem space that you're actually in at the time. TOGAF and FIF and DODAF are closely linked, I guess you could say. They are much more methodologically complete. They tell you what to do and when to do them in a project. They don't tell you why you should or whether it's going to be any use, but they do tell you what to do and when to do them. And The challenge with that, of course, is that what you can do is somebody gives you a problem. You say, right, well, I'm going to page 57 on the TOGAF manual. Oh, it looks like this kind of problem. It says I've got to produce these kind of documents and talk to these kind of people now. Oh, okay, well, I'm going to go in and going to spend 6 weeks doing that. Then you come back and you hand it to somebody who says, well, I don't care about that. Take it away. And unfortunately, you're probably not going to know that until you get there, which is why I said at the start, you probably need to go and get some sort of training and certification in this to see what you need to do with it. Because you can't really have an opinion on this until you've been through some of it. And as I say, for transitioning architects, unfortunately, there's going to be some wasted hours. So I would heartily recommend going and getting yourself certified in the Zackerman and TOGAF space. Microsoft has a thing called the Microsoft Business Architecture, which is a whole bunch of stuff associated with being an architect in Microsoft, and there's a methodology in there as well. And to be frank, you know, my employers would probably hate me for saying this. It fits the same model as all the other stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there that's useless. It's pretty complete, but some of it's useless. Some of it's great. But again, you don't know that until you've gone through the whole damn thing. It's probably not an encouraging message to new and potential architects. I could see quite a few of the old hands nodding sagely and giggling. They've clearly put behind them the pain and the irritation of having spent 6 months learning how to do this to then realize they're not going to use it anymore. It's kind of a bit like, you know, all those exams that you did when you were at school, and then somebody says to you, well, did you ever use that anymore? No, I've got a calculator for that. Let's talk a bit more about creating. Again, there's a bit of methodology in here, I think. And these couple of slides are really talking about filling your head through with some of the baseline stuff. When you're in a creating space, creating for a business equals change. If your business isn't changing, you shouldn't really be creating stuff, because otherwise you're wasting their time and money. And if they catch you doing it, they get quite annoyed. So particularly when you're in the technical space, creating equals project. And if you have to know how to deal with the project, then you have to have some understanding of the methodologies that project people use, which is about understanding the viewpoint that they're coming from, and you can only do that if you know what they're on about. One of the curses, and I'm sure you've all come across it many times before, one of the curses of being a technical person is you'll be expected to understand things that are financial stuff, TCO, accounting models and all that kind of stuff. You know, you've got to go and make a business case. So, okay, well, it's not really your thing, you know. But you'll go and figure it out, and you do a pretty good job of it, and you present it to people. Doesn't work the other way, I'm afraid. It's a bit of a one-way thing. The business person will sit there and, you know, you'll get to a point in the presentation where you think you've done the TCO thing very well, and it's all hanging together very nicely. And then somebody will say, oh, well, tell me a bit more about that technology problem then. Just remind me. So you'll start to talk, and you think, oh, well, I've got the idea a bit. I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. And you get about 30 seconds in, and their eyes glaze over, and somebody says, oh, well, you see, I'm not an IT person. I don't understand any of this. Alas, that's the viewpoint they're taking, and you have to work through it. So you have to understand their language. The project methodology side of things, look, there's dozens of those. Again, as a growing architect, if you're not across some of this stuff, particularly in your organization, go and ask to be inducted onto their project management course. If your organization, you know, has project managers, ask for that on your training plan. Get it put in there so that at least you know what language they're using, because then you've got a chance of going and mapping that back to the language that you're using. You can understand their viewpoint. You know, project manager, what's he incentivized on? Time to delivery, budget. Doesn't really care about whether it's functionally fit for purpose. It's not what he's incentivized for. You do. But he doesn't understand that. He just sees that you want to spend more money than he's got and take 6 months longer than he has. There are two pretty different viewpoints going on there. The sooner you can get that stuff exposed to each other as to say, look, I know why you're doing that, and you know why I'm doing that. Can we at least have a conversation without punching each other in the head? We might be in a position to actually move on a little bit. But what you can't do is rely on them to understand what you're talking about. You need to get into their side of things and figure that out. You can't go about creating without having a plan. Creating as an architect isn't a free-form thing in terms of, you know, getting a bit of paper out and can you tell what it is yet, kind of big picture. You actually have to sit down and have a bit of a think about that, and understanding who your audience is and create accordingly. So back to what I said before with the methodologies. turning to page 50 in the TOGAF manual and doing your thing is no good to anybody if they don't care. So everything that you create has to pass the who cares test. And if the only answer to who cares is you and your mum, you've done the wrong thing. It might be really good, but it's the wrong thing. It gets very disappointing that sometimes. I have to say, I've fallen in that trap a number of times. Oh, it's a beautiful piece of work. Nobody cares. Ah, well, I'll learn one day. Here's getting into some of the meat of it, and there's a whole bunch of resources, by the way, at the end. So it's kind of a big ramble from me. The communication and collaboration side of things. If you're going to be a really good architect, you need to be able to talk to people and listen to them. You also need to be able to write it down in a way that they understand and they care about. In practice, this is where you get skilled at writing two different versions of what you've got. You've kind of got one side that's the public consumption, and you've got the other side that's the real stuff that's important to you. You can probably hand that off to some of the technical people within your project team as well, and they'll get that as well and think that you're smart. Business person glaze over, not interested. Well, they like the shiny picture on the front. The shiny picture on the front links to the thing on the back because you've written it well. You might be on a winner there, particularly if you've either listened or appeared to listen to what that person was saying. So using the tool sets to help you walk the mile, well, that's what I was saying beforehand, is that probably the commonest problem I see in the communication and collaboration space isn't with the technical people. Architects annoy the technical people sometimes. You know, you're trying to deal with your head of infrastructure and you're saying to him, no, look, you've got to redesign all that, and the way that you're running your operations right now doesn't work anymore because we've got a new model for that. Well, that annoys them. But typically, you're on some sort of level footing where you might have come out of that kind of background. You can at least have a conversation about how annoyed you are with each other, and that's fine. But with the business people, they quite often just don't get it at all. Don't see where the value comes from. Don't see why, well, how do you know about my business? How dare you suggest process improvements? How dare you suggest that my arrangement of people might be suboptimal? Well, kind of measured stuff and used the tool sets, really, and we've got a bit of evidence. You know, we don't just make this up. Might help. It still doesn't, however, get that person into your frame of mind. One of the big pitfalls that I've fallen into, again, many times as an architect, is thinking that just because I presented a case that had information that was valid and true, that meant it was acceptable. It doesn't work like that. It's not how business decisions get made. Understanding those perspectives is a pretty critical thing. And the tool sets can help you walk the mile. There are things within the tool sets, particularly within the business architecture frameworks. The Zachman stuff's quite good for that as well. At least giving you an idea of which other people in your organization are going to be interested in the kind of problem space that you're currently in and why it might impact them and what kinds of things they might be thinking about that. Being an architect is not a solo gig. You can't do it on your own. It's not like if you get a bit of code to cut. You know, you've got to conform to an API, but as long as you're meeting those business requirements, whatever's inside that doesn't really matter anymore. You just can't do it on your own. So you need to be pretty open. That whole self-awareness thing that I talked about earlier on, there's no real training for that. You just have to open yourself up to it and let it go and say, hey, look, I need some help with this. I need to test this with my peers. Have I gone completely mad? Does this make sense? And that can be pretty painful to be that open. Throw it on the table and have people poke a stick at it. I know that my colleagues aren't shy in doing that. A few of them smiling at me in the room, and that's the way it should be. Within your architecture group, you have to be pretty brutal with each other and be prepared to do that. I'm going to talk about the network a bit as well in a minute. In that, one of the core tenets of being an architect and that you need to grow to learn to love is that reuse thing, and genuinely use the reuse thing, not the, oh, so they did it over there like that, and I like the idea, but I'm going to do it like this. Is genuinely get the viewpoint to see whether you can reuse that and use your network to help you try and find things. And I'll talk a little bit about the network side of things shortly. Holistic thinking and ambiguity. For everybody, the top bullet applies here. If you've been an architect for as long as I have or longer, there's a couple of you in the room I know who have, or you're just transitioning into this, you need a mentor. always to test your ideas, to give you a nudge, to hold you up, drag you over the coals, give you a kick, encourage you, love you, hate you, pick you up and throw you down. You need one as an architect. Because you need to trust them and they need to trust you so that you can take the really knotty, complex problems to them and whether you can find out whether you've gone mad or not. One of the hardest things to do as a new architect, gets a bit easier over time as you learn how to say no more politely to people, is taking on the right experience at the right time. Being a new architect and being thrown into a $20 million business transformation project as the lead architect is probably not a good thing. You might get through it and you might be a hero. You're most likely to get 6 months in and burst into tears because you don't know what you're doing. You don't want that. Your organization doesn't want that. That's where your mentor can help. Phone them up, get them in the room and say, does this, my ego tells me this would be great. Fantastic. The mentor's saying, not yet. Pay attention. Take time to think. This is probably the hardest for the techie folk in the room. There's a friend of mine back when I was coding many, many years ago, and he was my mentor then, I guess. He was a much more elegant coder than I was, really, really bright guy. He used to say to me, have you planned your work? I'd say, oh yeah, I've spent hours thinking about what I'm going to do. He said, do you think you're ready to put your fingers on the keyboard and start writing code? Yeah. No, you're not. And I get quite offended at the start. Oh, what do you mean I'm not ready? I said, well, have you taken enough time to think about what you've written? Well, I've written it all down. That was thinking while I was, no. Writing it down and thinking are different things. And of course, he was right, and I hated him for it. But creating that space to think within your own mindset, letting it go, saying, no, I'm not ready to start that. I actually need to think some more, is an important thing to be able to do. The only thing standing in the way of that, in my experience, is yourself, your eagerness to do things too quickly, and the commitments you might have made to your business partners. Try not to. Use your mentor. Use your peers. Ask people to stop you. Get them to grab you on the coattails and check it. If you can't explain what it is you're going to do and how you're going to go about doing it to somebody in a really simple, concise form, just verbally, in the space of about 30 seconds, you're not ready. Even if it's a complex problem, you should be able to distill what your approach is and how you're going to go about solving that. Developing your reasoning and objective thinking skills. People aren't objective. And we're not reasonable either. As I said earlier on, we've all got perspectives. Everything that we've done up until now makes us what we are and makes us think how we think today. And it's different from everybody else in the room and everybody else that you deal with. There are tools to help you think about that, and you have to develop them. If you don't, you're going to get caught out. You're going to go down a rabbit hole. This is the one I've found most challenging and therefore most fun over the years. As I said earlier, mostly because it feels like something that's muttery mumble, soft social science, not righty-downy type skill. And my belief was people who are great influencers are just like that because they're peoply kind of people and they can talk and make people see their way, and didn't realize that there's actually a skill set behind that. And there are tools that you can use that for righty-downy people like me, and I suspect most of you, you can sort of plot behaviors out onto a little chart and it can help give you ideas about what to do about it. Really useful. And again, when I was doing the training on that, I was thinking, how do you turn something that's so nebulous into that, into something that writes down and I don't believe that it works? And then I took it away and I tested it and it worked. So you've got to set aside some of those preconceived ideas that you have and say, well, I'm going to have a go at that. It's outside my comfort zone. It's what I said earlier on, outside my comfort zone, but it's an opportunity to grow. So there's a bunch of go-dos and resources in here that I'm going to talk about now for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. And this is where some of the practical stuff, the takeaways for this can come in. I've spent, best part of 40 minutes yakking on at you, world according to Duncan. But the key points really is that your development, whether it's as a person or as an architect, just doesn't happen by accident. You have to go and plan this stuff. And that means you. It doesn't mean your manager. It doesn't mean anybody else. It means that you have to go and do it, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And it's easy to say, I haven't got time and I'm too busy and the customer's making me do this. Well, that's too bad. If you don't want to commit to actually growing as an architect, then don't. Unless you're prepared to do it, you're not going to get there. However, to help you do that, get yourself a mentor. Get them now. I'll tell you where you can find some of those things in a minute. Try and get yourself onto your organization's training plans in that soft skills. Most organizations of a reasonable size will have some sort of budget where they send mostly non-technical people, rather oddly, and they're probably the ones who need it most, on some of these formal soft skills training courses about the listening, the communication, and the influencing. Just get yourself booked on them. Look for opportunities to coach others, even if you're new at this, even if you're just taking steps into architecture. There are things that you bring to it that allow you to coach others. I've never really walked the mile as a project manager, for example. No interest in that. But having some coaching from somebody who is, from their perspective, is an incredibly useful thing to do. I didn't do it by choice when I did it. Somebody said, you have to learn from this guy, and I accepted that person's advice, and it was good advice, and I took the time to do it, and it was really useful for me and my development as an architect. So whatever your background is in here, and you're aspiring to move into being an architect, you have a coaching opportunity to give back somewhere else as well. And one of the things about teaching, coaching, mentoring others is how much you learn about your own thought processes and what you've got going in your head, even by describing simple things to them. Things that seem simple to you, they've never heard of before. And the last bullet, sadly, unfortunately, is that, that get trained, get certified thing on the formal methodologies. I genuinely do think that you have to go and do it. It's only a couple of weeks out of your life. Some of it will be really, really good for you. Character building, as my dad used to say. I always used to say, I've got plenty of that already, Dad. No, wasn't having it. These slides are all available on the portal, by the way, and God help you, they're shooting movie footage of me, so you can pick that up and play it to your heart's content if you wish. So these are some examples of places to go. So there's TOGAF, there's Zachman. Interestingly, I was just poking around on the Zachman International site over the weekend, and because of a failure to communicate and collaborate, the Zachman organization appears to be collapsing. The guy who runs the North American operation has had a big fight with John Zachman, and they've taken their websites down, and they're both publishing nasty letters about each other. It's not the whole kind of communication, collaboration, conflict resolution thing that you'd want as a professional architect. There you go. And Sam Holkman, who was John Zachman's partner in business for many, many years, Sam's working now in the same field, and you'll find him at eacoe.com. He runs a kind of whole set of training materials around the different parts of enterprise architecture. There's an organization called Architecting the Enterprise. They are a commercial organization. They are probably the biggest trainers in various of the frameworks and methodology that make stuff available to us in New Zealand. They run Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch-based training courses. They can come on premise if you've got a large enough crew, or you can go to a training center nearby you. They also run stuff in Aussie if you want to get away and have some sunshine and convince your boss that that's a good place to go. They took a bit of it, even just a few years ago, it was actually quite difficult to get these training organizations to come to New Zealand and do some of this. So it's good that it's increasing. Our partners, the New Zealand Computer Society. I think, is that there? Oh, I might have got, yeah, I've missed a Z there. Oh dear. I'll correct that on the side that goes up. The New Zealand Computer Society is great in terms of the mentoring and certification stuff. They have a great mentoring program. They have a great program in terms of helping people's certifications mean something and mean something in practice that fits in with the mentoring program. I'd really urge you to go and look at that. It's, New Zealand Computer Society is about the members who are in it and what you give out and put back in. And they take this stuff pretty seriously. And I've been mentoring, not formally for them, but for somebody who is going to be a mentor for them for a little while now. And it's been quite an interesting experience seeing how that goes. You've got your Project Management Institute, so you can figure out all that project management Prince methodology side of things. And there are a couple of other training companies on there that do similar methodology and architecture type training. So a few takeaways from that one. Again, Computer Society on the mentoring and network development. There's a whole bunch of groups out there. There's a couple of good LinkedIn groups, the Australasian Architecture Network on LinkedIn. Get yourself signed in there and lurk for a while and see what kind of conversations people are having. I know as a Microsoft employee having something up there that's got Google written on it, but the Enterprise Architecture Network on Google Groups is actually quite an active forum and place again to go and look. All sorts of different viewpoints and things going on there. They're good places to kind of pick up the smell of what's going on. A good website called enterprisearchitectureforum.com. Again, a whole bunch of learning materials, training materials and stuff in there. That's just good to kind of immerse yourself in. And of course, an opportunity to go up to Sydney and mess about at Gartner once in a while. They're running better and better architecture tracks each time I go. So if you can get yourself up there, there tend to be quite a lot of people from different countries, different worldviews who've been practicing architecture for quite a long time up there. And, and like with all of these things, he said doing himself down, it's not necessarily presentation per se, that's where you get the value from something like this. It's a couple of bits and nuggets of information you get out of an hour of me yakking on, plus the networking, it's actually where the real value is. Influencing a communication. There's an American organization called Vital Smarts. These are the people who I had my training from on the whole influencing thing. These are a bunch of cognitive scientists who have applied their thinking and reasoning to business problems over a number of years and taking examples of people who've done really quite extraordinarily influential things and then try to figure out how did they do that? What was it that they did to influence, hundreds of thousands of people to do things differently, and then bring that to a business context. A couple of training organisations within New Zealand as well. Open Polytechnic runs some really good stuff on how to be a good writer, how to communicate really clearly in the written form. And then there's the New Zealand Association of Neuro-Linguistic Planning, it's easy for me to say, who, again, talk about some of that social science side of things, about how people think and how decisions get made and how to take different viewpoints on it. And I think that's about all I had. It is. I'm done.